Thanks to ACME and to Sarah and David and everyone who's been involved in inviting me here today. So the title of my talk today, Spaces of Resurgence, Rupturing Colonialscapes. I'm going to try to kind of weave together both some academic stuff and some not so academic stuff. So hopefully there's a bit of a balance in there for us tonight, and hopefully I won't put you to sleep. I know it's getting late. So on April 1st, 2012, a group of several hundred people gathered in Wagalisla, or Bella Bella, a small coastal town of the Heiltsuk community, close neighbors of my community, the Kwagil people. This group of Heiltsuk sang, danced, and feasted as a panel of federal commissioners arrived for 4 days of hearings into a proposed oil pipeline as part of the joint with communities all along the proposed pipeline route. Heiltsuk people, young and old, gathered with their supporters to make their presence known to federal representatives, as well as to welcome hereditary chief Wayala, who was arriving on the same plane. The power of these performances led to the joint review panel hearings being cancelled for a day, because the federal representatives said they feared for their safety, even though the Heiltsuk were not protesting the hearings themselves. Publicly displaying, as you can see here, crests, songs, dances, and regalia which have been passed on through many generations, the Heiltsuk demonstrated solidarity against the pipeline in tandem with other Indigenous communities along the pipeline route. I would argue that these enactments of Indigenous ceremonial practices were deemed threatening in part because they demonstrated territorial relations which disrupted the assumptions embedded in the federal consultation process itself. The review process, as with all aspects of state-determined relations, positioned Indians as colonial subjects whose rights and identities are constituted through the Indian Act. Despite the lack of treaties in Heiltsuk territories, as with most of British Columbia, the rights of the Heiltsuk are limited to the boundaries of federally delineated Indian reserve lands. As Indians, Heiltsuk people are permitted to express their opinion on pipeline development through the standardized review process within the governmentally determined consultation process. However, despite the feast or potlatch system being illegal for more than 80 years, the Heiltsuk are one of many coastal nations who kept these practices alive, a system in which their own laws, identities, and obligations to the land, animals, and ancestors are maintained. Feasting might be understood as active resistance to the spatially and temporally bound rights which emerge from their categorization as Indians, threatening to expose the constructedness of Indians and reserves which have come to be taken for granted in Canadian social relations. So in Heiltsuk territories and beyond, diverse expressions of Indigenous cultural and political resurgence have come into public view in recent years across the lands now known as Canada through opposition or reaction to incursions into Indigenous territories for the purpose of resource extraction and development, as well as the I'll Know More movement. Additionally, public marches and vigils have made visible a diversity of mourning practices, along with disgust at the lack of governmental and legal action to put an end to widespread violence against Indigenous girls and women. For example, the recent murder of Inuit student Loretta Saunders triggered widespread actions in her name, a continuation of the long-standing organizing that has been happening within Indigenous communities in response to this relentless violence. Today, however, I'm going to look beyond these publicly visible displays of resurgence in emphasizing that resurgence also unfolds at more intimate levels, which often go unseen by those outside the context in which they take place. I would argue, in fact, that intimate, everyday, embodied spaces of resurgence have always been vital to the survival of Indigenous people and our ways of being in the face of ongoing colonial violence. These everyday practices are at the heart of our identities as Indigenous people and our ability to continue to live our obligations arising from long-standing relationships in our specific territories. And it's from these territorial relations that our languages arise, that our cultural practices emerge, that our laws are formed. In the face of colonial socio-legal efforts to continually remake us as Indians, Cherokee scholar and activist Jeff Corntassel asks, how will your ancestors and future generations recognize you as Indigenous? Corntassel goes on to challenge Indigenous people to re-envision and to practice everyday resurgence. And today, I want to show you some of the ways in which Indigenous people are and have been doing just that. I see this discussion of resurgence as an example of what economic geographers J.K. Gibson Graham call a performative ontological project, bringing new worlds into being through the articulation of non-hegemonic systems of thought in order to make them more real, more viable in everyday life. Here I'm interested in recategorizing Native people as active legal and political agents, rather than just as pure victims or subjects under a totalizing system of colonial rule. As Alaskan Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck has said, scholarship which takes a damage-centered approach frames our communities as spaces saturated in the fantasies of outsiders. Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith further calls for approaches to knowledge creation which resist being boxed and labeled according to categories which do not fit. As I'll show today, spaces of resurgence which are unfolding in a diversity of ways across Turtle Island are an active refusal of our categorization as Indian subjects and our tethering to Indian reserves through which our colonial subjectivity is formed. This discussion of Indigenous resurgence arises from my desire to represent our lives as Indigenous people anew. Having worked on issues of violence in Indigenous communities across BC for the past 15 years, I want to speak of my relations in terms which allow for the possibility of our survival, not only our victimization. I want to speak of my identity, not only as one constituted through the Indian status card that sits in my wallet, but through the generations of ancestors before me who danced our laws with honor. I want to speak of the spaces we inhabit together as comprised through relationships not only of colonial power, but also the ongoing, ever-present possibility of Indigenous territorial relations which orient me toward the shoreline of Kwakwaka'wakw territories. I seek then not only to unmap or rehistoricize Indigenous people's experience of law and power in colonial Canada, but to remap our daily material realities in terms which make it possible to express our worldviews more fully. In pursuing this investigation of everyday resurgence, it is necessary to first understand, I think, the context of neocolonial relations in which these diverse actions take place. Therefore, I'll first discuss the development of Indian reserves in British Columbia and their relationship to broad socio-legal relations of power, before returning to this discussion of spaces of resurgence, suggesting some possibilities that arise from making these spaces more visible and politically viable. So growing up, my Ukrainian English mother and I lived away from the reserve where my dad's Kwakwaka'wakw family lived, but I visited there every so often for ceremony. Driving the length of Vancouver Island to its northern shores, I participated in our potlatches and feasts, enactment of our rights as Kwakwaka'wakw people. Yet each time I visited, some violent incident infused my experience of this place. In junior high school, my mom and I moved to a reserve in Victoria, where she still is, and where I lived until I was 17. And here I became more familiar with everyday life on reserve and came to understand the diversity of social, political, and cultural influences which give Indian reserves their texture. No longer just associated with violence on the one hand and ceremony on the other, the reserve became my home, where I lived slightly out of place with my white mother. The Indian reserve is therefore not a far-off place for me, a site of my work, nor purely an imagined geography of colonialism, but a place with which I am intimately familiar, having inhabited them as a status Indian, crossing the imagined borders which give reserves their shape and meaning. As Cole Harris and others have shown, Indian reserves can be understood as a manifestation of colonial ideologies, produced in order to realize the ongoing dispossession of Native people, of their territories, and to establish the sovereignty of the Canadian state. Reserves in BC, in particular, came into being through a land policy with a mandate to grant minuscule reserves and ignore title. Through this process, Native people became trespassers in their own territories, at the same time as becoming subjects of the Federal Indian Act as status Indians. As Doug Harris notes in his account of reserves and fisheries in BC, reserves became points of attachment within Native people's broader traditional territories, but little more. As legal and social categories, reserves and Indians are ontologically linked and inherently co-constitutive in their definition and regulation through the Federal Indian Act. Embedded in these concepts are racist ideologies which justified and legitimated colonialism in the first place, positioning Indigenous people as inferior to Europeans. The categorization of Indians as the racialized subject of European settlers was integral to the formation of reserves. As Harris writes, had natives been treated as people rather than as Indians, there would not have been reserves. The logics underpinning the reception of law in Canada can be traced to its roots in terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. According to Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs, the myth of European discovery of Canada embedded in Canadian law continues to perpetuate the myth of inferiority of Indigenous peoples, categorizing Indians as incapable of governing themselves and incapable of formulating law. I understand these interrelated geographic imaginaries as colonialscapes, representations of the space now called Canada, which perpetuate and manifest colonial expressions of power. So just as landscapes appear to create a complete view of a particular space and their cultural overlay, colonialscapes create the appearance that colonial representations of Canada, rooted in cultural, political, and economic power which are central to local and national identities, are somehow true. Indians do belong on reserves. Indians are inferior to Europeans, and Indians are in need of government help. Categories of Indians and Indian space have become naturalized in Canadian society and in much scholarship on Indigenous government relations. We see these categories at work when we talk about Native people migrating from reserves to cities, where cities are seen as being non-Indian cities, making the underlying territorial presence of Indigenous people invisible. And statistics which continue to focus on the number of Indians living on or off reserve reinforce that expectation that Indians belong on reserve. This framing undermines claims of Indigenous people to anything more than those point of attachments within their traditional territories that together cover all of North America. Colonialscapes thus blanket over prior and depot spatial orders of Native people, naturalizing the marginalized status of Indians as failed colonial subjects, citizens of dirty and distant Indian reserves. Yet reserves are more than delineated geographic spaces. They are also imagined sites through which status Indians are produced, such that Indians, I would argue, could be understood as reserved subjects, as the social stigma of the reserve, that imagined space of the reserve, travels with Indigenous people throughout Canada. Ideas about reserves and Indians serve to legitimize, for example, state intervention and surveillance both on and off reserve, as Indigenous people are seen as unable to govern themselves, their families, and communities. Even when not technically on reserve then, being treated as a subject of the reserve, that is out of place and carrying the stigma of the reserve, is always an emergent possibility. Within the colonialscape, any space within Canadian jurisdiction can also be made to be terra nullius, as the empty lands imaginary can be seen as underpinning, for example, natural resource acquisition throughout northern BC, as oil, pipelines, fracking, and other resource extraction are imagined as occurring on unused or uninhabited land. Alternately, frontier logics can be used to justify the need to bring a law and order approach to clean up supposedly lawless spaces. As Dean, Sanchez, and others have argued, colonial BC was described very much in the same ways as the downtown east side of Vancouver is today, as wasted space. As Dean describes, the characterization of life in the downtown east side as degenerate and as waste is an old frontier trick remade for a contemporary moment. Gentrification might be understood as a new word for conquest, as it uses a similar discourse to claim jurisdiction over Indian space in the name of progress. In representing the downtown east side as the frontier, Indigenous people, sex workers, homeless people, and other residents fail to adequately claim or occupy this space. So represented within terra nullius, frontier, or reserve logics then, Indian subjects fail to prove jurisdiction over their own territories due to various interrelated rationales. For example, not adequately making use of the space within contemporary economies, being portrayed as violent threats to the state, or being made dependent on the state for their own well-being. Thus, we can see that these nested rationales of the reserve, frontier, and terra nullius are capable of producing different kinds of imagined Indian subjects to support shifting colonial priorities. Further, the stigma of being of the reserve impacts Indigenous people's quality of life and their ability to be treated as fully human. The impact of racist dehumanization can be seen in everyday interactions between Indigenous people and representatives of Canadian institutions, such as social workers, police, and healthcare providers. For example, in a study of Indigenous people's experiences of healthcare services in northern British Columbia, Sarah DeLeo and her collaborators show the ways in which status Indians, as residents of rural reserves, are racialized in their interactions with healthcare practitioners. Stories about racism from healthcare providers, and I would say likely alongside negative interactions with social workers, police officers, and other representatives of state systems, impact Indigenous people's access to those systems. They also experience harm through the actions of individuals who have the agency and the power to enforce or ignore state policies. In these ways, DeLu and others demonstrate how the pathologization of reserve spaces extends to the bodies of status Indians, turning any place they might travel within Canada into a possible state of exception, as Indians remain tethered to the reserve through the Indian Act, as well as through these social norms. I'm just going to have a sip of water. This was also evident in my recent research on the normalization of violence against Indigenous people, particularly girls and women. The repercussions of being made a reserve subject is clear, and really couldn't be much clearer, in the cases of hundreds, if not thousands, of Indigenous girls and women who've been killed or abducted over the past 30 years and beyond. Native women are not only targeted in urban spaces such as the downtown east side, but also on rural highways, in small cities, and in our own homes, wherever we may be. Through tracing the mundane, everyday details of interactions between Indigenous women and representatives of Canadian law, I show how these engagements serve to normalize and perpetuate violence. As subjects of the reserve, Indian women are subjects against whom violence is expected and often normalized. As the recently released RCMP report graphics here make clear, Native women themselves are portrayed as responsible for the violence they face due to their own alcohol use or criminality. And meanwhile, racism, gendered violence, poverty, and state neglect go unseen. We don't see any of those named there. Although the discourse of missing and murdered Indigenous women then is now a nationally visible issue, which when I started working on this, it definitely was not. Indeed, this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women has been turned into a poster campaign, a funding stream, an inquiry, a police report, and a hashtag. This visibility has failed to result in changes in the material reality of violence experienced by Native women every day. While changes have been seen in the levels of awareness and an increased ability to talk about violence at a community level, which is important, violence remains a daily reality. Given the inaction on the part of officials of Canadian justice, Indigenous communities are turning to the resurgence of Indigenous practices which work to denormalize this violence. And importantly, as I will discuss in a little bit, the activation of Indigenous people's agency is central to these strategies. Indeed, the cases of missing women themselves would not have become publicly recognized were it not for the ongoing work of Indigenous women in the downtown east side who fought for police recognition of this violence for many years before the public, the media, or academics took notice. These examples make clear that Indigenous people are turned into residents of Indian space not only through the Indian Act, but the everyday actions of Canadian legal technicians. Further, colonialscape rationales embedded in everyday social relations cover up the ways in which reserve realities of poverty, isolation, and ill health are produced through policies and programs of neglect. Reserves were never set up to thrive, but to make themselves obsolete by getting rid of Indians altogether. Choctaw scholar Jody Bird's analysis of U.S. empire is useful here, as she contends that Indianness can be felt and intuited as a presence, and yet apprehending it as a process is difficult, if not impossible, precisely because Indianness has served as the field through which structures have always already been produced. It is not the reserve that is ubiquitous then, but the colonial imaginary, which is based on Indigenous erasure. So, however, despite the overwhelming forces of colonialism, Indigenous people have maintained and sustained our own legal subjectivity through activations of cultural, legal, and political systems that were here prior to settlement. Although these systems of rights, social norms, and identities may not be recognized by Canadian law as law, they are productive of systems of knowledge which are lived in tensions with those of the colonialscape. We have a nice map of, these are all of the language groups in British Columbia, which are, through the Indian Act, all made the same. As diverse acts of resurgence make visible, it's in these tensions and dynamics of legal pluralism, the coexistence of Canadian and Indigenous legal systems, that Indigenous people's political consciousness and identities are formed. For people participating in and witnessing the feasting at the opening of the Joint Review Panel in Waglisla, their consciousness as legal subjects were being formed in relation to both Celtic and Canadian law. It is thus worth exploring how these acts of resurgence might counter the power and violence of colonialscapes, both within and beyond the lives of the Indigenous people involved in acts of resurgence. And I'd like to talk about several aspects of the decolonial work accomplished by enactments of resurgence, with a focus on everyday intimate relations that normally go unseen, that don't make it into the newspapers. So first, resurgence, I think, has the potential to unreserve Indians by positioning Indigenous people as active legal and political agents rather than just subjects of the state. As I mentioned earlier, state responses to violence have thus far failed to result in any real changes in the rates of murder or disappearance of Native girls and women. Rather than appealing to a system which itself has been integral to histories of violence and which centers on the power of judges, police officers, and lawyers, many Native people are turning instead to local solutions to violence. Anishinaabe author Leanne Simpson sees the relentless realities of gendered violence as a strong reminder that resurgence is about bodies and land. She writes that movements such as Idle No More must be created with plans in place to deal with gendered violence in an effective way, including on-the-ground local strategies to prevent and intervene in violent situations. And this reality became clear to her when a young woman was sexually assaulted as backlash to local Idle No More actions. Rather than just turning to the police for help, organizations like the Native Youth Sexual Health Network are building knowledge and skills at a local level among small groups of Indigenous youth to increase their ability to name gendered violence and its relationship to colonialism. I recently interviewed Chawinnis, a friend and mentor from the Nuu-chah-nulth Nation located on the west coast of what's now known as Vancouver Island. You can see the Nuu-chah-nulth right there next to my community. For many years, Chawinnis was involved in highly visible political actions to protect and advance Indigenous self-determination, such as in the West Coast Warrior Society, which trained its members to defend Indigenous homelands. The warriors were involved in blockades and other actions to prevent what they saw as unlawful incursions into unceded territories for the purposes of development and resource extraction. And the warriors disbanded in 2005 amidst allegations of terrorism and a series of raids in the homes of society members by the RCMP's Integrated National Security Enforcement Team. After consulting with their elders and family members, the group decided to rededicate themselves to defending their territories and communities through nonviolent political and social struggle to advance Indigenous cultural, political, and social resurgence. Chawinnis explained that her own consciousness as Nuu-chah-nulth has involved learning about the violence of the state and colonial relations, as well as learning about the laws and practices of her own people. She was recently seated as one of her chief's warriors in recognition of her role as a protector and defender of her community. And that's a role that's normally reserved for men. Yet after a girl in her community was sexually assaulted, Chawinnis felt compelled to focus her energy internally, organizing a series of marches to honor young women in coming-of-age ceremonies as a way to revive respect for young women. Her ability to do this rested on her intimate cultural knowledge and her role as a leader and warrior in the community, examples of everyday resurgence which are only seen by Chawinnis and her relatives. And I would note that this photo is not of that march because there are no photos online. They're not searchable because they were only seen by those local people. So The events did not rely on government funding, but were supported by local communities and families themselves, calling on girls and women to hold each other up and to let young people know someone believes in them. Rather than only focusing on colonialism or what needs to be healed, the focus of the marches was on building strength within, activating the agency of community members themselves to prevent further violence in that community. Chowinnis said, "It changed my life. It was only a 10-day march, and I realized how important it was. It wasn't very popular. It wasn't in the media. There wasn't a pre-made blockade. There were no burning tires, no nothing." Chowinnis said that through stories, dances, and ceremonies, Nuu-chah-nulth teachings tell each other that violence against one another is not acceptable, and that this must be the foundation for anti-violence strategies in the community. While these local acts to honor Nuu-chah-nulth girls might be seen by some as social actions taken on a small scale outside the realm of law, I instead position these acts of resurgence at the center of pluralistic, overlapping, and dynamic legal geographies. Indeed, this might be understood as the scale at which Indigenous law operates, through a network of relationships among people, the land, animals, and ancestors. Chowinnis described her responsibilities toward a fire at the center of her community, saying some women are oriented toward the fire, while others work outside the community with their backs to the fire. Yet regardless of whether she is working within or outside the community, Chowinnis remains oriented toward that fire, relentlessly coastal, she says, in orientation, which she says means that no one gets to decide who we are. We get to decide who we are, and we will do what we think is best for us. It's not like we don't know there's this overarching Canadian legal system, the state that's affecting us. But she goes on to say that the ability of Nuu-chah-nulth people to enact their obligations toward that fire in the center of their communities is dependent on giving life to their ways, knowing their stories and their own laws, and treating one another the way they ought to be treated. The activation of these Nuu-chah-nulth teachings demonstrate the distinction between the legal subjectivity of an Indian and a Nuu-chah-nulth person, or a Quagga person. While violence against Indians might have been normalized, violence against Quagga people, I would say, is qualitatively, indeed ontologically different. Recognizing me as Quagga means that my identity and legal subjectivity is constituted within Indigenous epistemologies, rather than colonially defined terms in which I am inherently an Indian subject against whom violence is expected. As Chowinnis has shown, being able to recognize one another as Indigenous, not as Indians, is at the heart of our ability to engage in resurgence of our own laws at a local level. Another possibility emerging within spaces of resurgence is exposing the unfinished business of settlement and the incompleteness of colonization. I find that much scholarship focusing on colonial power mentions Indigenous resurgence as a side note, or Indigenous resistance as a side note, rather than a strong current through which the project of colonialism was unsuccessful. Even though state-determined policies and laws hold great power in our everyday lives and are responsible for much death and struggle, Indigenous people and our ways of life do continue to thrive in spite of this violence. In the opening example of the feast, Heldsic people refer to rights, relationships, and obligations that existed prior to Canada. Potlatches are spaces in which coastal peoples pass on the stories, laws, and responsibilities that have governed our communities for countless generations. And although the Heldsic feast did become visible because of its relationship to the pipeline hearings, these ceremonies are usually only visible to those who participate in them. Maintained among networks with a shared orientation towards coastal territories, potlatches remain spaces of resurgence for communities who have never given up their territorial claims. Despite being confined in many ways to Indian reserves, Indigenous people on the coast have been steadfast in their refusal to give up their ways of life, which are practiced seasonally within our traditional territories. A Heldsic chief stated in 1917, "The government has not bought any land from us, so as far as we know, we are simply lending this land to the government. It does not matter how long the government take to determine this question, we will remain the same in our ideas about this matter. We consider that the government is stealing land from us, and we also understand that it is unlawful for the government to take this land." The fee system asserts this ongoing claim to Celtic territories and enacts their jurisdiction within their own terms, at the same time as they pursue the treaty negotiations. And while the treaty process is determined by processes of Canadian law, not Celtic law, the ongoing enactments of Celtic law are still central to their treaty claim. This analysis suggests that within the politics of state recognition, Indigenous people can be legible to the state as members of Indian bands, so for example here participating in the federal process of consultation, while at the same time performing distinctly Indigenous legal ontologies. The two are not mutually exclusive but can be enacted simultaneously. So while some Indigenous people choose to negotiate with the government, such as through the Assembly of First Nations as elected chiefs in the band system, others choose to enact a policy of refusal by making it known that Indigenous practices do not need government approval. Perhaps these are the new kind of transformation figures our ancestors told us about and embodied in potlatch ceremonies. Transformation figures which have the possibility of shifting our position to one of empowerment and agency as their teachings retain their active nature in creating new possibilities for the next generations. Here I have a transformation mask from potlatch ceremony, or that would traditionally be used there. Transformation figures are not only subjects of our cosmology, but also provide teachings for who we are as Indigenous people. Colonialism involved the imposition and legislation of racial, gendered, and myriad other binaristic categories. Struggles over status have been important because of the unequal ways rights and resources have been allocated through the Indian Act. Yet we are in trouble if we mistake status for a true measure of Indigenous identity. Categories of race and gender imposed through the Indian Act have been tools of implementing a patriarchal system of governance while delegitimizing Native peoples' own identities, rooted in the roles and responsibilities through which our ways of life are maintained. And the resurgence of Indigenous names for our nations, our positions in the community, and our gendered roles is therefore vital to decolonization. While the Indian Act erased non-binaristic gender identities by literally legislating out anyone who did not fit into the categories of man and woman, Two-Spirit people have never gone away. Making Two-Spirit people's lives visible demonstrates that Indigenous people have not lived their lives according to Indian Act categories, but have continued to embody indigeneity all along. The body itself is an expression of self-determined ways of living which emerge from place-based teachings and express ways of being that extend across and beyond Indian reserve boundaries. Actor and writer Wawate Fobister demonstrates such expressions of lived and embodied resurgence in his play Agokwe. Fobister explains that as a storyteller, their role is to bring trickster and shapeshifter figures to life, making Two-Spirit roles and realities more viable as a form of rebirth. Fobister explains that finding the word Agokwe itself, which means man-woman in Ojibwe, was an important form of recognition arising from Ojibwe ontologies of gender. As a role model for other Indigenous youth, Fobister's own Two-Spirit identity and the public performance of Agokwe within community settings are vital sites of Ojibwe's resurgence. Woven throughout these stories is the potential for Indigenous resurgence to position Indigenous people within long-standing territorial relations, as I've been saying, rather than as subjects of Indian reserves. And as I shared earlier, as a young person, I associated reserves both with violence and with ceremony, as the colonial nature of reserve life coexisted alongside the decolonial nature of our cultural practices. Yet my relatives did not enact their relationships to the land, animals, plants, and ancestors only within reserve boundaries. They traveled and continue to travel throughout our territories in maintaining our responsibilities. Fishing, harvesting shellfish, and gathering local berries and other plants are integral to life on the coast, as is the use of cedar bark and cedar trees for regalia, masks, and totem poles. Culturally specific teachings govern the quality of relations among the people, animals, and land in the maintenance of these ways of life, and they are passed on through the potlatch system. The crests, songs, and feasting through which Kwakwaka'wakw systems of law operate are exercises in Indigenous jurisdiction, recalling a framework of meaning that operates as ontologically distinct from, yet alongside that of Canadian law. and my ability to eventually see and honor these deeper relationships that lie beneath and beyond reserve boundaries has been central to the resurgence of my own understanding of the territories from which my identities and my obligations arise as a colonial person. It is at the interpersonal level of our relationship that this expanded understanding of our territories can begin to disrupt the normative meaning of being on the res. I recently attended a funeral for a young woman my age who died as a result of long-term health problems. She was a member of the Lekwungen Nation with ancestry on her mother's side from Sahis, where my father's family is from. As I sat and listened to the songs being sung in her memory, I looked around the room and reflected on the space in which we had gathered to mourn. Yes, the funeral was taking place in an area legally deemed an Indian reserve by the federal government, and yes, the room was primarily filled with status Indians who were registered with the local band. I reflected on the fact that the thin walls and fluorescent lights in the building were likely approved by someone in Ottawa before they could be constructed. And I also wondered why the dirt road outside was full of muddy potholes and why the bathrooms were in a portable and not attached to the building itself. So were we in a colonially defined space? As a speaker from Sahis stood up to take the floor, I reflected on the cultural frameworks that he and others called into being. He was speaking not as a status Indian, but as a Kwakwaka'wakw person and a visitor there in the Lekwungen territories. The speaker talked about his respect for the family and local community and advised us to stay strong in our cultural practices in order to give our children something to hold on to. A group of elders rose to sing in the Kwakwaka'wakw language, honoring the young woman in the culture of her mother's family. It seemed the speaker's legal consciousness had very little to do with Canada, but referenced the older and related orders of Indigenous law emerging both from their territorial relations and the ones in which we were situated. Although we were on an Indian reserve, we were also in the Lekwungen territories as visitors from our own Kwakwaka'wakw homelands. The violence of colonial law was proven to be unsuccessful in attempting to turn Indigenous people into colonial subjects, into reserved Indians. It often seems easy for activists and scholars alike to forget that these older, deeper relationships with the ocean, the land, and its Indigenous peoples are always and everywhere an emergent possibility, not only in publicly visible political actions, but in our everyday relationships and embodiments of indigeneity. A funeral can be a site of cultural resurgence. So can teaching a child to sing or dance at a potlatch, learning how to pronounce the place names of our territories, dreaming the dreams of our ancestors. While it is vital that critical scholars and activists invest energy in understanding dominant relations of power and their manifestation in creating particular kinds of spatio-legal relations, I think there is a great danger in further erasing Indigenous perspectives by ignoring their implications in how we theorize Canadian geographies. For example, we might consider the space within which we're gathered here today. For this is not only an art center in the city of St. Catharines, nor just a session within a geography conference. It is also within, and I thank you for giving me the pronunciation, Haudenosaunee territories. But turning to the epistemologies within my own potlatch or feasting traditions, this lecture might also be understood as an enactment of my role as a witness, itself a space of resurgence. In the oral tradition of the feast system, individuals are paid to witness the events that take place, to experience and to remember what has unfolded. Witnesses then have an obligation to recall what they've seen if the events should be called into question in the future. Thus, in my work on violence and law over the years, I see my responsibility as to continue to recall both the oppression and the resistance that I've witnessed. Where academia attempts to train us to capture knowledge in a particular way within a professional role, this work is also part of a lifelong journey of taking up my duties and responsibilities as Kwakwaka'wakw. As John Burroughs has written, we may wander far and wide, but our journeys generally take their orientation from an older sense of our place in the world. This very room, then, might be seen as a space of resurgence as I take up my role as witness, despite being at a distance from Kwakwaka'wakw territories. Being a witness means sometimes reviving old words or creating new ones, telling old stories anew and validating those voices that are most at risk of being erased. As Gayatri Spivak argued, if there is no valid institutional background for resistance, it cannot be recognized. Witnessing then might be understood as a methodology in which we're obligated, through a set of relational responsibilities, to ensure frameworks of representation allow for the lives we have witnessed to be made visible. Critical scholars and activists can contribute to making geographies of Indigenous resurgence more viable by recognizing their persistent presence in theorizations of power, law, and space. There is an ethical imperative, I think, to not only recognize large-scale or highly politicized assertions of Indigenous jurisdictions, such as in land use or treaty rights, but the smaller everyday level of our relationships, which are constituted by networks of individuals. As these networks grow, as we orient ourselves toward the fires at the center of Indigenous law on the lands in which we live, we together hold the potential to rupture colonialscape relations in order to trouble the violence which has ensured its naturalization. Terra nullius, the frontier, Indian reserves. Beneath and beyond these colonial spatialities lies the dreams of my ancestors, brought to life through my actions and yours, and the actions we initiate in the spaces between us. As a mixed political Kwakiwak woman, my own spatial orientation has always been to the shoreline, not to the ocean itself, but the space where water meets land and light, where the tides turn all the elements together in an ever-present yet ever-changing jumble. This place of change is alive with the wealth of my ancestors and holds the possibility for entry into conversation with the supernatural realm. Staring out from this place, I frequently think of Sisu, who's here on this button blanket. The double-headed sea serpent who can bring wealth to someone who's lucky enough to see it, or can bring death by shape-shifting into a canoe, only to swallow those who ride in it. Sisu was my grandmother's crest, reminding me of our potential to transform ourselves into different forms in order to serve our communities and our own purposes. In my work on violence over the years, I've begun to see that we are in the process of transforming our legal and social identities so that we now recognize one another not only as victims, but also as agents of renewal. The time has come to take seriously our personal and collective potential for transformation, creating spaces of socio-legal change, collision, and multiplicity, in which we can reimagine our communities, ourselves, and one another anew.